way that we interact with other people and the decisions that we make. So I'm generally really interested in understanding sort of the role of the face and facial expressions in social interactions and how it might relate to both successful and unsuccessful interactions, and how it also might relate to sort of good versus bad decision making. So in terms of what is in a face, well, we know that we spend our lives interacting with other people, and in these interactions we look at each other's faces and they provide us with a wealth of information. So when you look at a face, what do you see? Well, the first thing that you see is what somebody looks like. So somebody's face will provide you sort of fixed, static, appearance-based information that will tell you something about their age, about their gender identity, about their ethnicity, their social group membership. However, when we look at faces, they're not static things. They're dynamic, they're expressive. And so we also get additional information from the expression that someone puts on their face, and that tells us something about their intentions or their motives, or maybe what they're thinking or what they might be likely to do next. So in that sense, you can imagine that they're really useful for helping us make decisions. And the quality of interactions and their outcomes, and the same for decisions, also depend on how we interpret the expressions of another person. So talking about facial expressions being meaningful, this is actually a family photo that I think shows 4 distinct evaluations of the same situation. So if you imagine, when you place them into context, facial expressions actually clearly communicate information about how somebody is evaluating their current situation. So I would argue here there's quite a linear trajectory in the log flume boat from excitement through to fear. And so sort of walking through it step by step, because I just think it's important. This is my dad. Clearly is communicating that he's very happy to be where he is and he's having a lovely time on the ride. This is me. I was a bit younger then. This is me having mostly a good time but a little bit scared. This is my sister, who's mostly scared but a little bit having a good time. And this is my mum, definitely not having a good time at all. And putting all of these expressions into context and thinking about what they're doing, those expressions are telling you something about how the person is currently experiencing the event, and it might tell you something about their motives and intentions. So you might guess that my dad probably went on that ride again. You might guess that my mum absolutely did not go on that ride again. That would be exactly how that day panned out. But also, there's another level on this. If you think about them in terms of a social interaction or decision making, if you were deciding whether to go on the ride, if you were stood watching the pictures of people coming through and deciding, do I want to go on this ride or not, depending on whose face you looked at, you might make a different decision. If you looked at my dad, you might be like, hey, I think that ride might be quite fun, I should get on. If you looked at my mum, you might make a different decision. So facial expressions communicate information not only about how the person is appraising their current situation, but they also tell you something about how they might act, and they also can inform the decisions that we make as well. And so, like I said, depending on what you saw there, you might make a different decision. But the important thing is, as well, is that they're really based within a context. So if you took those facial expressions out of context, they wouldn't be so helpful to you in terms of making a decision. So actually, reading people's facial expressions and using them to guide our decision making is something that we do from a really young age. And so that's been referred to in the literature as social referencing. So this is where an infant will look to its caregiver to help it make decisions about what to do or not to do in the world. And the important thing is this is information on what to do in a given situation. So again, this is embedded within context. So I'm just going to play this video. Hopefully it works. Hey, works this time. So this is what's called a visual cliff task. So in a visual cliff task, you have a plane of glass, and underneath it you have a checkerboard pattern that suddenly drops off quite dramatically. So visually it's a cliff, but there's some glass over the top. It's important because it's not ethical to harm babies in research, just in case you're wondering. So the infant goes towards the cliff and the caregiver produces a facial expression. So here the mother is producing an expression of fear, and the infant sees the mother's expression and utilises that to be like, well, I don't think that seems like a good idea, and so moves away from the cliff edge quite rapidly. and he generally looks quite horrified at the experience. So they then rerun the experiment, but this time the mother smiles at the infant, and you can see that the infant is then totally happy to have a go at climbing down this cliff, which is actually sort of about 1.5 meter drop. So in real life would hurt, but obviously here, like I said, it's not ethical to harm babies, so they didn't. So you can see that infants are really good at doing this. From a young age, they will use facial expressions to help inform their decisions about what to do in a given situation. We are also able to do this as adults, so there's some recent work, I say recent, my goodness, I've been giving this talk for too long, some fairly recent work done by some of my colleagues where they showed that if you played a prisoner's dilemma game, so in a prisoner's dilemma game, there are 2 players and each player can choose whether to cooperate or defect. If you both cooperate, you both get a reasonably good outcome. If one cooperates and one defects, then the person who defects gets a really good outcome, and the person who cooperates essentially gets a fairly bad outcome. And then if you both defect, you both get a bad outcome. Has anyone seen the TV program Golden Balls? Some nodding. Okay, there's a TV program based on this whole idea, and so yeah, basically you can watch if you want to have a quick look at Golden Balls online. It's a really interesting TV program that uses the prisoner's dilemma to see what people do. So people win some amount of money, and then they have to decide whether they split the pot of money at the end. And if they both split, they get half of it. If one splits and one steals, the one that steals gets all of it, and the one that splits gets nothing. And if they both steal, neither of them get anything. So this is the prisoner's dilemma setup. So using this setup, some colleagues showed that if you use facial expressions, you can actually people can learn whether an agent's going to be cooperative or is going to be competitive. So for the, I'm just going to put this all up at once because it's easier. So for the cooperative agent, they will smile when you both cooperate. They will show regret if they successfully defect. So if you cooperate and the agent defects, it shows regret. And it will show a neutral expression in the other 2 outcomes. So if the participant themselves actually successfully defected, or if you both defected, they just showed a neutral expression. The competitive agent, on the other hand, showed joy when they successfully defected on you, and showed regret expression if you both cooperated. And people were able to use a process they call reverse inference, but essentially is the idea that you could see if they were happy when you both cooperated, that means that was in line with their goals, so they're likely to cooperate again, and vice versa for the competitive agent. So people were able to learn this and adapt their behaviour accordingly in a prisoner's dilemma task. So hopefully I've convinced you that facial expressions have a communicative function, and so trying to understand them, it's important to think about them in terms of their social functionality, and that the meaning of facial expressions might be tied to several things such as the interaction setting, the people that are actually interacting, the goals of the people interacting, and potentially their behavioural history as well. So a lot of my work, and the work I'm going to talk about today, predominantly looks at smiles. And why do I do that? Well, because they're the most ubiquitous facial expression. Pretty much, if you record any live interaction, you definitely see smiles in abundance. You don't necessarily see a large variety of other expressions unless you manipulate the task in some way, shape or form to get things like anger or sort of frustration. So they're also a really fun thing to study because they are really, really powerful in the way that they influence our behaviour. They're really valuable to us. People will work hard to see them. And they sort of have the minimal disruption of the social equilibrium. It's one of my favourite phrases in the world. It basically means that smiles smooth interactions in a really nice way. And traditionally, there's sort of, broadly speaking, 2 types of smiles, so a genuine smile and a polite smile. So the difference between a genuine and a polite smile is all in the eyes. So the orbicularis oculi is active in a genuine smile. It is not in a polite smile. So if you think of it, it's like the crow's feet that you see around the eyes. That's the orbicularis oculi muscle. So when you are genuinely feeling positive emotion, people argue you see these genuine smiles, whereas when you are not feeling that genuine emotion, the smile on the right here, you see a polite smile but doesn't reach the eyes. And more recent work has started to, instead of talking about it in terms of genuine and polite, and instead of sort of defining smiles in terms of the internal emotional experience, they've started talking about it in terms of their social functionality. So there are two socially functional smiles which basically map onto the genuine and polite smile distinction of the past, and that is reward smiles. So reward smiles help reinforce behaviour, they are highly valuable, and they can induce positive effect in the person who is on the receiving end. And then you have polite smiles, which essentially aid the formation of social bonds. So polite smiles are still really important. So rather than calling them sort of real and fake smiles, like polite smiles have a function and an important social function. It's just not necessarily quite as rewarding or reinforcing as the genuine smile. So I'm going to talk to you, as I said, about 3 different projects today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about project 1, and then I'll give you a bit more information before I talk about the other projects after that. So my first project, we're currently doing some work, and this is with my DPhil supervisor. I still work with her. Obviously my DPhil must have gone well, because it's quite a few years later we're still working together, which is lovely. And we're doing some work now about how static appearance-based cues might influence decision-making. And then what happens to that, the effect of those cues when you add in dynamic cues. So a lot of research looking at the effect of facial expressions on decision making haven't sort of parceled out those 2 separate effects and looked at the effect of static versus dynamic cues. So that's what we aimed to do. So what did we do in the study? Well, we essentially got participants to play a trust game. So the way that a trust game works is you have an investor and a trustee. The investor gets given some number of points. They invest those with the trustee. The investment matures, in this case multiplied by 3, and then the trustee has the option of returning some of that investment to the investor. So obviously if the investor doesn't invest anything, the trustee doesn't get anything. But if the investor does invest, and the trustee doesn't return anything, the trustee does very well, but not for long, because the investor will stop investing. So this is sort of the nature of that game, is that really, for everyone to do well, you need to sort of cooperate together and invest highly and return fairly. So what we did with our participants was we created an individually calibrated set of faces. So every participant that came to the study rated a whole bunch of faces, and unbeknownst to them, we secretly were only interested in the rating of trust. And so we took their 4 highest rated faces in terms of trustworthiness and the 4 lowest rated faces in terms of trustworthiness. So it's individually calibrated for each participant. And then we put those faces into a trust game. We had 4 distinct patterns of behaviour. So we had a player that was always fair. We had a player that was always unfair in the trust game. So a fair player would always give the investor as much or more than they invested back. So they would basically stay equal or increase what they had. An unfair player would always give you back less than you invested. And then we had 2 50-50 players. One who started fair and ended unfair, and one who started unfair and ended fair. So there's a high trustworthy looking and a low trustworthy looking version of each of those faces. And I know that's an overwhelming amount of information that I've just put at you. So I'm going to now show you a really overwhelming graph just to round it all off nicely. So ignore 90% of those lines. So basically this is the trajectory of learning over 30 investment trials with each one of the different types of face. So you've got an always fair, a 50-50 starting fair, a 50-50 starting unfair, and an unfair version of a trustworthy and an untrustworthy face. You've got 8 faces that you're playing with. The thing I want to draw your attention to is these 2 bits here. So after you've done these 30 investments, we then looked at how much people would, we said, you know, if you invested, how much would you invest now you've learnt about this person? And what we found is that if you behaved unfairly, it didn't matter what you looked like to begin with. So whether someone thought you had a trustworthy or an untrustworthy face, it didn't matter. If you behaved unfairly, you got very low investments. However, and we were surprised by the size of this effect, the person right up at the top, that is the trustworthy looking face that played fairly 100% of the time. The next 2 that you see together, so you can't quite see, it's a black circle behind the grey square. That's the 100% fair, untrustworthy looking face, and the 50% fair, trustworthy looking face were treated the same. And then the 50% fair, untrustworthy looking face is the circle that you see just below. So what we essentially found is that after 30 experiences of investing with someone and experiencing their behaviour, it didn't matter what you looked like if you were an unfair player. But if you were a fair player, there was a significant advantage to those people who looked trustworthy in the first place. So we just weren't as good at learning about people who were fair despite their untrustworthy experience. Try that out again. Untrustworthy appearance. And essentially what this showed was that there is a real bias in our ability to learn about behaviour accurately based on somebody's appearance, which was a slightly depressing finding. So sorry to drop that bombshell on you. I was like, when we got this result, I was like, I mean, exciting, but ooh, not great. But then we thought, well, let's see if we can make this effect go away. And can we make this effect go away? The answer is yes. If you add a smile onto the face, you see the faces get treated equally. The interesting thing about this was we've done some further work. I didn't want to present 3 million graphs. We've done some further work since testing whether just a smile is enough in and of itself or whether the smile actually has to be combined with behaviour. And the answer is it does have to be combined with behaviour. So if somebody smiles at the point at which they play fair, in line with Danielle's work, we then find that this bias goes away and that untrustworthy and trustworthy looking faces are treated according to their behaviour, not their original appearance. But just smiling isn't enough to get rid of the effect in and of itself. It has to combine with the positive behaviour. So this again comes back to the idea and supports the idea that facial expressions actually really are important in interactions about communicating intentions, and if you communicate those positive intentions at a time you behave in a positive way, then you do get rid of this bias. We're also starting to do some really fun computer modelling work trying to work out what actually is going on and break down the different signals. So more to come on this work, but that's what I wanted to sort of talk about. So moving on topic a little bit, so there's another stream of my work where I'm interested in understanding the fact that, as I said, we're social animals, we spend a lot of our time interacting, and a lot of that has ultimately occurred within group environments. So we have a tendency to sort of seek out and affiliate ourselves with groups, and being part of a group is really important for our social identity. And our social identities are valuable to us, so they do shape the way that we interact with the world, and there's a lot of research that shows this. Specifically in the world of faces, we remember in-group faces, so our memory is better for members of our own group than other social groups. We process their faces more holistically. We essentially are more accurate when we identify their emotions. However, a large body of this work is cross-cultural in its nature, and therefore there are some other things that might explain some of these findings, such as familiarity or morphological differences. So recent work suggests that there might be an in-group advantage looking at expressions when you look within groups that are not based on culture. However, the evidence was a little wishy-washy, so we decided to do some work in this area. So to do this work, we use something called a minimal groups paradigm. So minimal groups paradigm is quite simple in the way that it works. So you essentially use some criteria to randomly separate people into groups. So for example, I've put art preference here because that's what we did, but there are versions of this where they do a dot estimation task. So you look at a bunch of dots on the screen and you have to estimate the number, and you do this a few times, and then at the end it tells you you're an overestimator or an underestimator. So you can see these are really meaningful categories. And so they use these sort of very arbitrary categories to separate people into groups. And in Tashbel's original study, once they've created these arbitrary groups using dot estimation or art preference, they then ask people to allocate money to in-group and out-group members. It's important to note this was not to themselves, this was always to other in-group and out-group members. There was no self-interest involved here. And really wildly, they found that he created these matrices. It was excellently beautiful in terms of the mathematics. So that there were sort of different possible options where you could either just maximise the in-group's earnings, or you could act in a way that minimised the out-group's earnings, or you could act in a way that maximised the difference between you at a cost of your own group's earnings. And that's what people did. So people actually didn't give their group the most regardless of what the out-group got. They gave their group as much as they could whilst making sure the out-group got as little as possible. So they maximised the difference between the groups. The conclusion is about conflict. Sorry, I pinched this slide from somewhere else and forgot to delete that last box. But interestingly, the conclusion of this study was actually all about that competition isn't necessary for conflict, but just having two groups is enough. But we were more interested in what groups did in terms of facial expressions. And there is some recent work that shows, so this is from a study where they asked people to rate the happiness presented by different smile types. And again, they call them false and true smiles, but these again map very nicely onto the genuine and polite smiles. And they essentially found that white participants were better or showed more discrimination in their happiness ratings for white faces compared to black faces. They also did some eye tracking and showed that this was related to the way that people actually paid attention to the faces. Predominantly, they paid more attention to the eyes of the white faces than the black faces, which is in line with the idea that the main difference between a genuine and polite smile is in the eye region. So if you're not paying attention to that region, it's going to be harder for you to notice that difference. So this is essentially what they found in a relatively recent paper, and we wanted to build on this work and ask whether groups actually change our ability to recognise smiles, and if so, how. And one of the things that was really important to us is that we actually did this in a relatively homogeneous face set, so that we removed sort of familiarity effects and so on and so forth, and instead we decided to do it using a minimal groups paradigm. So we created these arbitrary groups and wanted to see whether that would change your ability to recognise facial expressions. So essentially what happened, we got participants in, they watched a series of facial expressions on a video, and then they proceeded to rate the expression in terms of how genuine they were, and then they did a minimal groups task. They looked at some abstract art, and we then told them at the end, and it was always the same, that they preferred circles to squares. So again, I'm sure this is very important to their social identity. So we created this arbitrary grouping, so circles versus squares. They then re-watched the videos, and when they re-watched the videos, they were then provided with the group membership person of the video, which was either an in-group member, so also circle, an out-group member, square, or, sorry, we don't have the information for this person, so we had a control set of faces. So there's a couple of really important points, is that we did the baseline rating. So we didn't just want to look at the information when they had group information. We wanted to know, if you just take a bunch of faces, does adding group information change the way that someone responds to the same face and rates the same face? So again, these are a couple of the, I just wanted to show you what the expressions look like. So there's a genuine smile, and this one is a polite smile. So again, very similar to the other stimuli, but what was again important to us here is actually those smiles differ in their dynamics. So we didn't want to use static images in this one, we wanted to use the dynamic videos because there is cues to the smile type in the dynamics of the smile as well. So here in green is the in-group, in orange is the out-group, and the grey is the no-group information. So essentially what you can see is this is the ability to recognise smiles. So D prime is a mathematical signal detection number. So essentially we found that there was no difference in their ability to discriminate genuine from polite smiles when we added group information. So accuracy didn't change. So previous work had found that it did. Previous work had found differences in sort of real existing different groups. We did not find differences here. But what we found that was really interesting was that your response bias did change. So people were significantly stricter, and so this is a criterion measure. So this is when you see any given face, how likely are you to categorize it as genuine? In the out-group, you became much less likely to categorise it as genuine. In the in-group, you became more likely to categorise it as genuine, and it didn't really change where you didn't have group information. So essentially you got laxer with your criterion, and if you weren't sure, you were more likely to say that an in-group member was showing a genuine smile, and the opposite was true for out-group. And we were quite surprised by this finding because the minimal groups, I think I've probably made quite clear, is not necessarily a meaningful thing, and we literally just went, do a couple of questions. You have a circle personality. This smiler has a circle personality, and it changed the way that people responded to their expressions. So this is potentially a really, really powerful effect. We also found, in line with previous research, that we rated the in-group smilers as generally happier than the out-group smilers as well. So this is in parallel with some of that previous work. We've just done an eye-tracking version of the study to see if we can replicate the eye-tracking effects, but we've done eye-tracking again before we add group information and afterwards to see if adding group information changes the way that you actually look at and therefore gain information from faces. So the third and final sort of project that I want to talk to you about, as I said, the context is really, really important in terms of facial expressions. We need to understand something about the situation an expression is in order to understand its meaning. And in real life, facial expressions, I would argue, are heavily contextualized. You don't often see them just in isolation. They are always within an environmental context. And context will influence the way, therefore, you interpret an expression. And context can come from several different things. So it can come from the expressor themselves in terms of their body language. It can be external to the expressor, so other people, or the environment that they're in. And it also can come from within the observer in terms of the observer's prior experience of the person they're interacting with. So if I was to show you Adele here, hands up for who thinks Adele looks happy. Hands up for who thinks Adele looks sad. Cool. Hands up for who thinks Adele looks happy. Right, so you see how suddenly the context completely changes the meaning of the facial expression. So the facial expression in and of itself is really hard to interpret, yet when you see she's just won a Grammy, you're like, oh, she's like cry happy. She's so happy she's crying. Not she's sad and then she's crying. So the environmental context is really important to help us understand the facial expressions. And again, just because I find that people tend to sort of lose concentration at this point in my talk, I'm going to make you do some audience participation. So this is a study where they wanted to look at people's ability to accurately determine whether a tennis player had won or lost a point. So here there are 6 faces. I'll help you a little bit. 3 of them are winners and 3 of them are losers. Have a little chat with somebody near you and see if you can decide which 3 are winners and which 3 are losers. Wake yourselves back up. Chat to someone. See if you can work it out. Okay, so hopefully you've got some ideas. Hands up if you think number 1 is winning. Bad luck, most people in the room. That is a losing face. What about number 2? Hands up if you think they're winning. Okay, some of you got that right. That is, in fact, winning. Number 3, winning? Good, they are, in fact, winning. Number 4, winning. Oh, you're very accurate. They're losing. Sorry, the 2 people that thought they were winning. They're not. They're losing. Number 5, winning. Oh, you're getting better as we go. They are, in fact, losing. Well done. And number 6, winning or losing. Wrong. Losing. Okay, didn't end on a high. But as you can see, you are very much on track with the people that did this research. From face alone, it's really, really hard to tell whether they're winning or losing. So facial expressions carry a lot of meaning, but you need some context to it. Here the context they used was body context, and they found that if you had face and body, people were significantly more accurate than face alone, slightly more accurate than body alone. The body seemed easier to tell. So with that in mind, A1 and A2, one of those is winning, one of those is losing. Hands up for A1 being the winning body. And those who put your hands up are right, it is the winning body, so A2 is the losing. So again, you can see here that if you add contextual information, that's sort of really important to be able to understand what is going on. There is another study that showed that information external to the expressor was also really helpful. So in this study, participants had to decide whether a facial expression, a central facial expression, was displaying either fear or anger. And that's the target face in the centre here. And then in the periphery, they had a facial expression that was also expressing fear or anger and was either looking at the central face or looking away from the central face. And they essentially found that if the contextual emotion was anger and it was looking at the central face, you were much more likely to accurately recognise a fearful expression. Because obviously the contextual information, if someone's very angry and looking at you, you're probably more likely to be scared than anything else. So it helped people contextualise what the emotion was. So then one final study, which is very similar to what I ended up doing with my default student, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, took only polite smiles, so no genuine smiles in this particular study. They just took polite smiles, and they wanted to work out whether they could sort of change the way a polite smile was evaluated by putting it either in a sort of prototypically polite environment, so here in a sort of pharmacy in this particular one, or in a shopping environment, and then in a more enjoyment context, so eating an ice cream by the beach. And essentially what they found was that compared to the face alone, if it was put in a polite context, the genuineness ratings went down. If it was put in an enjoyment context, the genuineness ratings went up. So they were able to essentially change the way that that expression was evaluated by adding contextual information. So as I mentioned, some of the issues with a lot of this work is that they use static expressions. And so we wanted to have a look at this effect, but also use dynamic expressions. So we wanted to know whether situational context actually changes the way we interpret dynamic facial expressions, again, smiles. And then we also wanted to know if the effect was reciprocal. So can a smile influence the way you evaluate a given context? And then again, trying to understand how that might work. Sorry, my animations on that slide went horribly wrong, so I'll just put the whole thing up at once. So we ran 2 different studies. So there were reward and affiliation smiles, and there were positive or enjoyment contexts. There were polite contexts and negative contexts. And in the first study, you rated the face on its own, the expression on its own first, and then you rated the expression within the contexts. And in the second study, you rated the context on its own first, and then in the second block, you rated the context again, but this time an expression was present within it. And we had a look at some of these sort of more functional elements. So people rated sort of genuineness, enjoyment, politeness, and superiority. And when they rated this context, they rated them in terms of the valence, enjoyableness, politeness, and competitiveness. So we were interested in working out whether the context would change the way that we evaluated the expressions, and vice versa, whether expressions could change the way we evaluated contexts. So context had a really strong effect on smile ratings, in that smiles in enjoyment situations were rated as more genuine, as well as indicating less superiority than those in negative situations. But interestingly, there were significant differences in politeness. So this is where we found sort of the largest effect, such that when you were looking at ratings of reward smiles, weirdly not, again, we were expecting more differences in polite smiles. We found more differences in reward smiles, the joys of science, you have an idea, and it pans out, but never quite the way you think. So here we found more effects on the ratings of politeness. so that there were different ratings here. So if you look at the reward smile, reward smiles were seen as more polite when they were in a polite setting than they were in other settings, whereas the polite smiles didn't differ so much between the settings. So essentially we found that the evaluation of smiles is malleable and can be changed based on the context within which it is presented. We also found that smiles can influence the way that contexts are evaluated, but this is not true for negative contexts. So what we essentially found here was that whilst context paired with an enjoyment smile or a reward smile were rated as more positive than those paired with a polite smile, that didn't occur in negative situations, which sort of makes sense because the other situations are maybe slightly more ambiguous, so slightly more flexible in terms of how they could be evaluated, but negative situations they were pretty clearly negative, and so smiles didn't change the level of negativity as seen. And again, because I knew I would be tight on time, so I'm not going to go into all of the details, but we've just done this is quite explicit evaluations, and again, we don't walk around the world making explicit evaluations. We do behavioural things when we see expressions, so we've just done an approach avoidance task using a new app actually. So approach avoidance tasks used to be done with joysticks on a computer, which was a reasonable proxy for real world, but we now do it with a mobile phone. So you push the mobile phone physically away from you or pull it towards you, depending on the condition that you're in. And we've actually shown that when you're responding to a face, the context it in does influence the way that you respond to the face, but if you're responding to a context, the face does nothing. So essentially when we're evaluating a facial expression and how we might behaviourally react to it, so whether we want to approach it or push it away from us, that will depend on and will be changed by the context within which the expression appears. But if you're evaluating a context, an expression doesn't have the ability to sort of override those basic effects. So inherently, we process context as part of looking at a face, but we don't do the same in reverse. We don't automatically process faces as part of looking at contexts. So, to summarise, across the 3 studies, I hope I've given you some nice evidence to show that appearance cues can bias and influence the way that we behave and respond to other people, but that those can be overcome by more dynamic cues. So facial expressions are really, really important because they actually enable us to be more accurate at learning about other people, and they also enable us to make better decisions in an environmental context. We've also done some really nice work building on this where we show and again, I wanted to have time to talk about this study in full, but I will talk about it very briefly. We did a study where we put people into the lab and they filled out some personality questionnaires, got a generic personality profile back from their social partner and the person they were about to meet, and also some feedback that said the other person doesn't want to meet you because they don't think they're going to like you. So lovely piece of rejection feedback. Some more nuanced rejection feedback, which is the other person's not looking forward to meeting you because they're not feeling very sociable today, or the other person is looking forward to meeting you. And then we put people into a room and made them interact. That is ethical, turns out. We had to go through a lot of steps, but we did get the ethical bit. We did a lot of debriefing and making sure everyone was okay afterwards. But what was really interesting about it is we found that the person who received the rejection feedback didn't actually, at the end, they were like, oh, that interaction was so much better than I expected, I would totally meet the person again. So everyone was willing to meet their partner again, apart from the person who was paired with the person who got the rejection feedback. So the person who got the rejection feedback technically would have been rejected again. And we have analysed the data for that and found that it's because they don't reciprocate smiles accurately. So when you smile, someone tends to reciprocate the same type of smile. So if you smile genuinely at someone, they'll smile genuinely back. If someone smiles politely at you in a shop, you smile politely back. The people who received the rejection because of you feedback didn't reciprocate the smiles appropriately, so they tended to throw out genuine smiles. We think maybe because they were trying to connect socially, but it felt really weird to the other person who was interacting with them, and so they were less likely to want to interact with them again. So there is definitely some evidence to suggest that dynamic expressive cues are really important for social interactions and cohesion. We also show that social group is really important for being able to process these signals. Like I said, we're still doing some more work looking at this, but those dynamic cues, the way that we evaluate them, does still depend on some of the static information, and also sort of social group seems to be a really important element of that. And finally, the situational context in which an expression occurs is really important to understand the expression, and it can change the way that you evaluate the same expression. And like I said, we've got current evidence that we're still working on the data for to show that that's not just in terms of explicit evaluations, but also has implicit behavioural effects. And so I didn't want to spend ages sort of talking through all of the many ways that this work sort of has implications for thinking about sort of real world social things, but I am currently doing some work with some clinicians looking at the impacts of this for people with things like facial palsy. So facial palsy was a thing that was very sort of understudied and not a lot was known about, and then Justin Bieber recently had facial palsy, so it became much more of a thing. And so people seem to know a lot more about it, and there's a lot more interest in it, and so we're looking at the impacts of sort of not being able to express equally on both sides of your face, how that might impact your sort of social interactions in terms of the impact of expressions. We also are interested in doing some work looking at how this might affect sort of relationships as well, especially thinking about sort of clinical practitioner to patient relationship, how that might be influenced by the expressions that you see in those interactions. We're also interested in applying some of this work to sort of, now we're doing a lot more remote working and working online, how that might influence, because online a lot of contextual cues can get lost. So how do facial expressions work in an online setting when you don't necessarily have the contextual information? And also thinking about how it might relate to sort of interactions between social groups. So we know that there's a lot of social group interaction and contention, and sometimes those interactions don't go well, and sort of doing some further work trying to unpack and understand how we might be able to get over some of the issues we have in terms of facial expression, because obviously if you're misinterpreting each other's facial expressions, that's going to lead to less smooth interactions, so thinking about how we might be able to overcome or sort of approach that. Thank you. I ended slightly earlier than I intended to, but thank you so much for listening. Any questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Shore?
Yeah, very interesting talk, but I was wondering, is there anything you could read around this subject, I don't know, a website or something, you could find out more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, I don't have a website for my own work, and I really should, you're right, thank you. I should do that for my own work. There's actually some, if you're interested in the topic, there's some really good books that have come out recently, and in fact my postdoc supervisor, Brian Parkinson's, recently had a book come out called Heart to Heart, and it's all about some of this. Heart to Heart by Brian Parkinson's just is a recent book that's come out. But yeah, I have been approached recently about writing a book, and I'm thinking about doing it, but it's quite a big undertaking, so it's probably going to be at least a couple of years before my book is out. But I'll take that as a positive thing. I should either do a website and or write them. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, have you found if age seems to be a factor in how people react to the social influence of faces?
Yeah, so I haven't actually done any work myself looking at age, but there is evidence to suggest that there is, so when we're talking about group membership, there does seem to be some age biases, and there's evidence to suggest that our ability to recognise facial expressions, if you're a young adult in older adults, you're less accurate in older adults than you are in other young adults. So there is work suggesting that that might be a thing, but I haven't.
You showed us that the context plays a really important role. I wonder if it has been studied and measured whether this educational context, the financial context, would have different impact. Just to name two, but there were the other effects.
Yes.
The impact of the ability to differentiate polite from genuine smiles and take different readouts. So is context more than 50% contribution to the overall impression we're reading, or is it 20%? Or
that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a specific answer to that. So some of the work we're trying to do is trying to unpack the differential sort of levels to which context matters. And there is definitely work to show that other elements of context matter. So things like power, if there's differentials in power, there's differentials in facial expressions there as well. So there's a lot of factors. And so it's now, in terms of the research, it's trying to do a combination of sort of moving more into like live interactions and trying to look at what happens there, whilst also doing these controlled studies and seeing if you can parallel the effects. And there's new statistical models, not that anyone's ever particularly excited about those, but there are some really cool new statistical models that you can run that enable you to sort of start trying to parse out some sort of individual effects versus sort of higher level effects across stimuli and things like that. So we're working on trying to unpack the different factors and their relative importance, but that's probably a lifelong question.
Similar to the question about age, is there any work done on whether like gender has an impact on how you read facial expressions? Like whether members of a certain gender tend to be read as more friendly than another?
Yeah, so there's some work that suggests that you are more likely to sort of, some evidence that females are slightly better at doing this, but then there's other evidence that actually shows that if you set this experiment up such that you sort of make it a level playing field, you don't see these effects. So the evidence is mixed on that front. So I'm not convinced that there are huge gender differences, but there's some indication that there might be some. But again, I think weirdly context dependent.
So I was just wondering if the distinction between genuine and polite smiles was defined as if the eyes are squinting or if the orbicular oculi is being stimulated. In a hospital setting or during COVID where masks were used frequently, do patients or participants rely on auditory cues to make that distinction, or do they just not make that distinction at all?
So there's some work showing that when wearing facial masks it's harder to make the distinction, but it's not impossible to do so. But as a separate sort of stream, there's a lot of importance in terms of mimicking facial expressions, or there's some evidence to suggest that mimicry is really important, and that is definitely disrupted by mask wearing. So it doesn't remove our ability to do it, it does make it harder to do. So again, it potentially has implications for sort of so the smoothness of the social interaction and sort of cohesion between. But I think a lot of people communicated that they found that it was a barrier to communication, and the evidence suggests that it is a barrier, but not as much of a barrier as I think people felt it was.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Shore? Well, if not, could we please put our hands together to thank Dr. Shore? Thank you for coming for SciSocs Week 4 talk. Yes, I'm losing count already. And please have a good evening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.